Now, David said gently, I want you to think about times when you made assumptions about others. When you let fear or ignorance guide your decisions. This silence was longer, more uncomfortable. Elena realized that David wasn't just teaching her, he was creating a space for everyone to confront their own biases, to recognize that prejudice wasn't a character flaw belonging to evil people, but a human weakness that required constant vigilance. Ready for the complete story? Smash that subscribe button and tell me where you are tuning in from in the comments. Tomorrow brings another mind-blowing story that's just as unbelievable. Trust me, you will want to be here for it. Alright, let's jump into it. David Chin Williams adjusted his faded denim jacket as he stepped out of the modest Toyota Camry, deliberately leaving his Bentley in the garage across town. At 42, he'd learned that power meant nothing if you couldn't walk among people as they truly were, not as they pretended to be when they knew your net worth exceeded their yearly revenue. The October evening air carried the scent of expensive cologne and fresh bread from Le Jardin Noir, the crown jewel of his restaurant empire. 5 years ago, he'd purchased the struggling establishment and transformed it into the city's most exclusive dining destination. Tonight, he wanted to see it through different eyes, the eyes of David the customer, not David the owner. His reflection in the restaurant's towering windows showed a man deliberately underdressed, worn jeans, scuffed sneakers, and a jacket that had seen better decades. His dark skin seemed to absorb the golden light spilling from within, and he wondered, not for the first time, how many opportunities he'd been denied simply because of what people saw first. Remember, he whispered to himself, fingering the reservation confirmation on his phone, you're just David tonight. David who drives a 10-year-old car and wears thrift store clothes. David who might not belong. 3 blocks away, Elena Vasquez was having the worst month of her career. The 34-year-old restaurant manager stood in her cramped apartment bathroom, applying concealer under eyes that had forgotten what 8 hours of sleep felt like. Le Jardin Noir was hemorrhaging staff, and corporate had made it clear, improve performance or face replacement. She'd clawed her way up from server to manager in just 4 years, sending money home to her mother in El Salvador while building something that resembled stability. But stability was fragile when you were always one complaint away from unemployment. You can do this, Elena, she told her reflection, straightening the crisp black blazer that represented everything she'd worked for. Just one more perfect night. No mistakes. Her phone buzzed with another staff shortage notification. 2 servers had called in sick, leaving her team stretched impossibly thin. The pressure was crushing, but she'd learned to transform anxiety into hypervigilance, scanning every table, every guest, every detail that could make or break her career. At Le Jardin Noir, appearances mattered. The clientele expected perfection, and Elena had learned to read people in seconds, the way they dressed, carried themselves, spoke. It was survival, really. Cater to the powerful, maintain the standards, protect the reputation. She grabbed her keys, not knowing that tonight, her carefully constructed world would collide with someone who challenged every assumption she'd learned to make. David pushed through the heavy glass doors, immediately enveloped by the warm lighting and soft jazz that he'd personally approved during renovations. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across white tablecloths, and the gentle murmur of conversation mixed with the subtle clink of fine china. He approached the hostess station, where a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair looked up with a smile that flickered when she took in his appearance. "Good evening," David said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "I have a reservation. David Williams, 8 o'clock. The hostess, her name tag read Jessica, scrolled through her tablet with movements that seemed to slow as she processed the disconnect between his appearance and the reservation system. Let me just check with my manager." Elena appeared as if summoned, her dark eyes quickly assessing the situation. She saw immediately what Jessica had seen, a black man in clothes that didn't match their typical clientele, standing in a space where the average entree cost more than some people's weekly groceries. "Is there a problem?" Elena asked, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "No problem," David replied evenly. "Just checking on my reservation." Elena glanced at the tablet, then back at David. Something in her expression shifted, a calculation, a decision made in milliseconds. "Sir, I'm afraid we're completely booked tonight. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments down the street." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. David felt the familiar knot form in his stomach, the one that appeared whenever his humanity was reduced to a threat assessment based on melanin and clothing choices. But he kept his voice steady, almost gentle. "I have a confirmed reservation," he repeated, pulling out his phone. "Would you like to see it?" "Sir," Elena said, her tone gaining an edge of authority, "I understand your disappointment, but our reservations are quite exclusive. We serve a very particular clientele, and I'm sure you'd find our prices challenging." Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance. Other patrons glanced over with curiosity, some with recognition of a scene they'd witnessed before. The air grew thick with unspoken tensions, with the weight of history and the sharp edges of contemporary prejudice. David looked at Elena, really looked at her. He saw the exhaustion beneath her professional veneer, the desperation of someone fighting to maintain position in a world that offered few second chances. He recognized the fear, because he'd carried it himself once, before success had armored him against such casual cruelty. "I see," he said quietly, sliding his phone back into his pocket. "And if I were dressed differently? If I drove up in a different car?" Elena's cheeks flushed, but her chin lifted defiantly. "Sir, this has nothing to do with. It's simply a matter of availability and appropriateness." The word appropriateness landed like a slap. David nodded slowly, a decision crystallizing in his mind. Not the decision Elena expected, not anger or shouting or threats. Something else entirely. Something that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. "Thank you for clarifying your policies," he said, his voice carrying a strange gentleness that made Elena's defensive posture waver slightly. "I'll remember this conversation." As he turned toward the door, David caught his reflection again in the window. But this time, he didn't see David the customer or David the owner. He saw a man at a crossroads, about to choose between justice and something far more powerful. Behind him, Elena watched his departure with a mixture of relief and something she couldn't quite name, a hollow feeling that suggested she'd just made a mistake whose dimensions she couldn't yet fathom. The golden light of Le Jardin Noir seemed to dim slightly as the door closed behind him, and in the sudden quiet, Elena felt the first whisper of something that might have been conscience. David stood on the sidewalk outside Le Jardin Noir, the cool evening air sharp against his skin. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the restaurant he'd built from nothing, his vision made manifest in every carefully chosen detail. The irony wasn't lost on him, rejected from his own creation. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he rarely used anymore, Michael Torres, his general manager and the only person besides his lawyer who knew he owned the establishment. They'd agreed that David would remain anonymous, letting Michael handle day-to-day operations while David focused on expansion. "Michael," he said when the call connected, his voice steady despite the storm building inside. "I need you at the restaurant. Now." "Boss? Everything okay? I'm at my daughter's recital." "Bring the ownership documents. All of them." David's eyes never left Elena's figure moving between tables through the window. "And Michael? Don't announce yourself. Just observe." 20 minutes later, Michael Torres entered Le Jardin Noir through the kitchen entrance, his usually casual demeanor replaced by sharp professionalism. At 38, he'd worked his way up through David's restaurant group, earning trust through competence and unwavering loyalty. Elena was seating a couple at table 12 when she noticed the unfamiliar man in the expensive suit scanning the dining room. Something about his bearing, confident, assessing, sent a pulse of anxiety through her already frayed nerves. "Excuse me," she approached him with practiced grace, "are you waiting for someone?" Michael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, I'm here to see you, Ms. Vasquez. I'm Michael Torres, representing the ownership group of this establishment." The color drained from Elena's face. Ownership group. The mysterious investors who transformed the struggling bistro into the city's premier dining destination. She'd never met them, had barely spoken to Michael beyond brief email exchanges about policy and procedure. Is everything all right? She managed. I think we need to have a conversation, Michael said, his tone neutral but weighted with implication. About your service standards tonight. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. I'm not sure I understand. Michael pulled out his phone and showed her a photo, David, taken through the window 25 minutes earlier. This man attempted to honor a confirmed reservation tonight. Can you tell me what happened? The restaurant's ambient noise, clinking glasses, muted conversations, soft jazz, seemed to fade as Elena stared at the image. David's face looked back at her, and for the first time, she really saw him. Not the clothes or the car or her assumptions, but the man himself. The quiet dignity in his posture. The intelligence in his eyes. The patience he'd shown even as she'd insulted him. Elena's voice caught. He didn't look like he belonged here. Didn't look like he belonged, Michael repeated slowly. In what way? Elena's throat felt like sandpaper. Around them, the dinner service continued its elegant rhythm, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding near the bar. His clothes were casual. Old. He drove an older car. I thought he might be uncomfortable with our prices. So you denied him service. It wasn't a question, but Elena nodded anyway, shame burning through her chest like acid. Michael set his phone down and pulled out a leather portfolio. With deliberate care, he withdrew several documents, incorporation papers, property deeds, business licenses. All bearing one name, David Chin-Williams. Ms. Vasquez, Michael said quietly, meet your employer. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the nearest table as the world tilted sideways. The man she'd turned away, the man she deemed unworthy of her restaurant, owned everything around her. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the job she'd fought so hard to keep. That's impossible, she whispered. David Chin-Williams. Princeton MBA, former investment banker, current owner of 17 restaurants across 3 states. Net worth approximately $47 million. Michael's voice remained professionally calm, but Elena could hear the steel beneath. He built this place from nothing. Chose every piece of furniture, approved every menu item, personally interviewed the original management team. Elena sank into the nearest chair, her legs no longer capable of supporting her. The magnitude of her mistake crashed over her in waves. Not just the discrimination, not just the cruelty, but the sheer impossibility of what she'd done, rejecting her own boss from his own establishment. He's coming back, isn't he? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Michael glanced toward the entrance. He's already here. The restaurant's front door opened, and David Chin-Williams walked in. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him came a woman in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase, and another man Elena recognized as corporate counsel from the parent company. This David was different from the one she dismissed an hour earlier. Same face, same skin, but everything else had transformed. He moved with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to owning every room he entered. His casual clothes now seemed like exactly what they were, a deliberate choice by a man powerful enough to dress however he pleased. The restaurant's energy shifted immediately. Conversations quieted. Staff members straightened unconsciously. Even the kitchen noise seemed to diminish. Elena stood on unsteady legs, watching David approach. His eyes met hers across the dining room, and she saw something that terrified her more than anger, profound sadness. Ms. Vasquez, David said when he reached her, his voice carrying easily in the suddenly quiet space. I believe we have some business to discuss. Mr. Chin-Williams, Elena's voice cracked. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. You didn't know who I was, David interrupted gently. But you knew who you thought I was. And based on that assumption, you denied me service in my own restaurant. The nearby tables were now openly watching. Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes. The judgment she'd so casually dispensed now reflected back at her. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. I made a mistake, she whispered. Yes, David agreed. You did. The question now is what we do about it. Elena looked around the restaurant, at the staff who depended on their jobs, at the customers who trusted the establishment's reputation, at the empire she'd just threatened through her prejudice. The weight of consequences pressed down on her like a physical force. Are you firing me? She asked, though she already knew the answer had to be yes. David studied her for a long moment. In his eyes, she saw the accumulated weight of every slight, every assumption, every door closed based on appearance rather than merit. But she also saw something else, a calculation happening in real time, a decision being made that would affect far more than just her employment. Ms. Vasquez, David said finally, his voice carrying through the hushed dining room, that depends entirely on what happens next. The air between them crackled with tension and possibility. Around them, the restaurant held its breath, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. Not just for Elena, not just for David, but for everyone who believed that people could be measured by the cut of their clothes rather than the content of their character. David's next words would either destroy Elena's world or offer her something she'd never expected, the chance to rebuild it on a foundation of truth rather than assumption. The moment stretched, heavy with the weight of decision and the fragile possibility of redemption. The silence in Le Jardin Noir stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Elena felt the eyes of every patron, every staff member, boring into her as she stood face to face with the man whose dignity she'd trampled. Her mind raced, searching for explanations that might soften the blow, justifications that could somehow make her actions seem reasonable. Mr. Chin-Williams, she began, her voice stronger than she felt, I want you to understand that my decision tonight had nothing to do with your race. We have very strict policies about dress code and... Stop. David's voice cut through her words like a blade. Not loud, not angry, but carrying an authority that made every excuse die in her throat. Please don't insult both our intelligences by pretending this was about clothing. Elena's cheeks burned, but desperation made her push forward. We serve celebrities, politicians, business leaders. They expect a certain atmosphere, a certain standard. If I let just anyone. David repeated the words slowly, as if tasting poison. Is that what you see when you look at me, Ms. Vasquez? Despite the confirmed reservation, despite my polite demeanor, despite treating your staff with respect, I'm just anyone? That's not what I meant. Then tell me what you meant. David's voice remained calm, but Elena could see the storm building behind his eyes. Explain to me how a confirmed reservation becomes invalid based on the customer's appearance. Help me understand the policy that allows you to judge someone's financial capability from across a room. Around them, the restaurant's carefully orchestrated evening began to fracture. Servers hovered uncertainly, unsure whether to continue service or wait for resolution. At table 7, a prominent city councilman discreetly recorded the confrontation on his phone. The manager of a competing restaurant at table 12 was already composing a social media post that would be viral within hours. Elena felt the weight of her career, her mother's medical bills, her carefully constructed life crumbling in real time. The defensive wall she'd built throughout years of clawing her way up from nothing slammed into place. I was protecting the restaurant's reputation, she said, her chin lifting defiantly. You have to understand the pressure I'm under. Corporate expects. Corporate. David's laugh was bitter. Ms. Vasquez, I am corporate. I'm the owner you've never met, the mysterious investor your reports go to, the person who signs your paychecks. He gestured to the dining room around them. Every decision you've made to protect this place has been made in service to me. And tonight, You decided I wasn't worthy of my own establishment. The words hit Elena like physical blows, but instead of backing down, something fierce and frightened rose in her chest. How was I supposed to know that? You came in looking like... Like what? David stepped closer, and Elena could see the decades of accumulated hurt in his eyes. Like a black man who doesn't know his place? Like someone who might disturb your white clientele's comfort? Say it, Ms. Vasquez. At least have the courage to be honest about what you saw. Elena's breath came in short gasps. The truth sat in her throat like broken glass, too painful to swallow, too sharp to speak. Because he was right, and they both knew it. She had seen his skin color first, his clothes second, and made a calculation based on fear and prejudice she'd never wanted to acknowledge. But admitting that would mean accepting that everything she told herself about being fair, about being professional, about earning her position through merit alone, was a lie. It would mean confronting the ugly reality that she'd become part of the system she'd once fought against. I was doing my job, she whispered, the words hollow even to her own ears. Michael Torres, who had been silently observing the exchange, stepped forward. Elena, perhaps you should. No. David raised a hand, stopping his general manager mid-sentence. His eyes never left Elena's face. Let her finish. I want to hear how discriminating against your own employer constitutes doing your job. Elena's hands shook as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She was trapped between admitting to conscious racism and maintaining a lie that was becoming more transparent by the second. The restaurant around her, the job she'd fought for, the stability she'd built, the respect she'd earned, was dissolving like sugar in rain. I made a judgment call, she said, grasping for any foothold in the avalanche of her collapsing world. Based on experience, based on what I thought was best for the business. If that makes me a terrible person, then fine. But I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Weren't you? David's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the now silent restaurant. When you told me I'd be more comfortable somewhere else, when you suggested our prices would be challenging for me, when you decided I wasn't appropriate for your establishment, what exactly did you think you were doing? Elena opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Because the truth was too enormous, too devastating to voice. She had been trying to hurt him, to put him in what she'd perceived as his proper place, to maintain a social order that kept people like her safe by keeping people like him out. David watched her struggle, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Ms. Vasquez, do you have any idea how many times I've stood where you're standing? How many times have I been denied service, followed in stores, questioned about whether I could afford to be somewhere? Do you know what it feels like to achieve everything you've dreamed of, only to discover that none of it matters when someone decides you don't belong based on the color of your skin? Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. I'm sorry. Are you? Or are you sorry you got caught? The question hung in the air like smoke. Elena stared at David, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time all evening. Not as a threat to be managed or a problem to be solved, but as a human being whose dignity she had casually, carelessly destroyed. And in that moment of clarity, she realized that her sorrow wasn't just about getting caught. It was about recognizing herself in his words, seeing the times she'd been on the receiving end of judgment and assumptions. The loan officer who'd questioned her ability to pay rent on her apartment. The country club where she'd worked as a server, whose members had looked right through her as if she were furniture. She had become what she'd once despised, and the realization was more devastating than any termination could be. I don't know, she whispered, the first completely honest words she'd spoken all evening. I don't know if I'm sorry for hurting you or sorry for destroying my life. I don't know if I can tell the difference anymore. David studied her for a long moment, and Elena saw something shift in his expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the recognition of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, facing the choice between falling and learning to fly. At least, he said quietly, that's honest. The dining room remained suspended in tension, waiting for resolution that seemed impossible. How do you bridge a gap carved by centuries of prejudice? How do you repair trust shattered by assumptions that run deeper than conscious thought? But in the space between Elena's raw honesty and David's cautious recognition, something fragile began to form. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but the possibility that both might be earned rather than simply granted. Elena straightened her shoulders, a decision crystallizing in her mind. Mr. Chin-Williams, I know I can't undo what I did tonight. I know I can't take back the words or the assumptions or the pain I caused. But I'm asking, not for my job, because I know I don't deserve it, but for the chance to understand. To learn how I became someone I never wanted to be. David considered her words, the weight of decision heavy on his shoulders. Around them, the restaurant held its breath, sensing that what happened next would echo far beyond this single evening. The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility and fraught with a dangerous hope that people could change, that understanding could grow from the ashes of prejudice, that love, unexpected and transformative, might emerge from the most unlikely places. David looked at Elena for what felt like an eternity, her request hanging between them like a bridge neither was sure could bear their weight. Around them, the restaurant's careful orchestration had completely dissolved. Servers clustered near the kitchen doors, whispering among themselves. Patrons had abandoned all pretense of dining, their attention fixed on the drama unfolding at the center of their exclusive evening. You want to understand, David repeated slowly. Ms. Vasquez, understanding isn't something I can give you in a 10-minute conversation. It's not a PowerPoint presentation or a diversity training seminar. Elena nodded, her hands still trembling but her voice gaining strength. I know. But I'm asking anyway. Before David could respond, his phone buzzed urgently. Michael's eyes widened as he read over his shoulder, a Twitter notification that made both men's faces pale. Boss, Michael whispered, we have a problem. The video was already spreading across social media like wildfire. Shot from Table 7, it captured Elena's initial rejection of David, his dignified response, and his subsequent return as the revealed owner. #restaurant racism was trending, with thousands of shares and increasingly inflammatory commentary. 17 minutes, Michael said grimly, scrolling through the cascading notifications. That's how long it took to go viral. David's jaw tightened as he read the comments. His business empire, built over 15 years of meticulous reputation management, was being dissected by internet strangers who knew nothing about his values, his hiring practices, or his commitment to equality. Elena peered at the phone screen and felt her stomach drop. Her face was clearly visible, her words audible. Within hours, she would be the face of restaurant discrimination, her name associated with racism in every corner of the internet. This is disaster, she breathed. Yes, David agreed, but his tone was thoughtful rather than angry. For both of us. More notifications flooded in. Restaurant competitors were already distancing themselves, advertising their inclusive policies. Food critics were drafting scathing reviews. Corporate clients were reconsidering events booked at David's establishments. Mr. Chin-Williams, Elena said desperately, I'll make a statement. I'll take full responsibility, explain that you tried to educate me, that this doesn't represent your values. Stop. David held up a hand. Do you think that will help? You apologizing while I fire you sends exactly the wrong message. It looks like damage control, not genuine change. He was right, and they both knew it. Elena's termination would be seen as scapegoating, David's reputation would remain tarnished, and nothing would actually improve. Michael approached them carefully. Boss, I've got Channel 7 on line 1. They want a statement in the next hour, or they're running with what they have. David looked around his restaurant, his pride, his legacy, his contribution to a city that had given him opportunities while simultaneously questioning his right to claim them. Then he looked at Elena, seeing not just the woman who had hurt him, but a person trapped in the same impossible situation. Clear the restaurant, he said quietly. Sir. Michael looked confused. You heard me. Apologize to every table, offer them dinner vouchers for next week, and clear the dining room. Now. As staff began the delicate process of evacuating confused and curious patrons, David turned back to Elena. You asked for a chance to understand. Tonight, you're going to get it. We're going to sit in this restaurant, together, and figure out how to fix what's broken. Not just the public relations disaster, but the actual problem. Elena's eyes widened. You want me to stay? I want you to learn. Because firing you solves nothing. You'll go to another restaurant, make the same assumptions, and hurt other people. The cycle continues. David's voice carried a weariness that spoke to years of fighting battles that should have been won decades ago. But if you can actually change, if you can become part of the solution instead of the problem, then maybe something good comes from this nightmare. As the last customer was escorted out with profuse apologies and promises of compensation, Le Jardin Noir fell into an unusual quiet. The kitchen staff remained, preparing food that would go unserved, while David, Elena, and Michael found themselves alone in the elegant dining room that had witnessed so much pain. Sir, one of the servers approached hesitantly, should we continue prep for tomorrow? David looked at the young man, barely 22, working his way through culinary school, and made another decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Yes. But first, I want everyone to sit down. Kitchen staff, servers, hosts, everyone. He gestured to the empty dining room. If we're going to talk about prejudice and assumptions, we're going to do it as a family. Elena watched in amazement as David's staff, her staff she realized, gathered around the large central table usually reserved for VIP parties. There was Carlos, the sous chef who'd been with the restaurant since opening. Jennifer, the sommelier who'd trained in France. Marcus, the host who was studying pre-law. People she'd worked beside for months, whose names she knew, whose schedule she managed, but whose stories she'd never learned. What happened tonight, David said, addressing the group, happened because we've all learned to make assumptions about people based on appearance. Some of those assumptions protect us, some hurt us, and some, like what occurred this evening, hurt innocent people. He looked directly at Elena. Ms. Vasquez made a mistake. A serious, hurtful mistake that damaged someone's dignity and threatened our restaurant's reputation. But before we condemn her, I want each of you to think about a time when you were judged unfairly. When someone made assumptions about you that were wrong. The table fell silent. Elena could see staff members shifting uncomfortably, recognizing the truth in David's words. Jennifer, the sommelier, spoke first. When I was studying in Bordeaux, the other students assumed I was there on charity because I'm Latina. They couldn't believe I'd earned my scholarship. Marcus nodded. College admissions counselor told me I should consider more realistic schools when I said I wanted to study law. Said someone with my background should focus on practical skills. Carlos, who rarely spoke in staff meetings, cleared his throat. When I first came from Mexico, restaurant owners would hire me to wash dishes but wouldn't let me cook. It didn't matter that I'd trained in Mexico City's best kitchens. One by one, David's staff shared moments of being reduced to assumptions, of having their humanity questioned based on surface details. And with each story, Elena felt the weight of recognition. These weren't abstract examples. They were her colleagues, people she'd respected professionally but never seen fully as individuals with rich, complex histories. Now, David said gently, I want you to think about times when you made assumptions about others. When you let fear or ignorance guide your decisions. This silence was longer, more uncomfortable. Elena realized that David wasn't just teaching her, he was creating a space for everyone to confront their own biases, to recognize that prejudice wasn't a character flaw belonging to evil people, but a human weakness that required constant vigilance. I assumed the new delivery driver was stealing tips, Jennifer admitted quietly. Because he looked rough. Turns out he was working 3 jobs to support his sick father. I thought the woman who complained about her steak was just being difficult, Carlos said. Didn't realize she was a food critic until she published a review praising everything except our dismissive attitude toward customer concerns. As the circle of honesty continued, Elena felt something shifting inside her chest. The defensive walls she'd built were crumbling, not under attack, but under the weight of shared humanity. These people, her people, had faced the same struggles, made the same mistakes, carried the same fears. "Elena," David said softly, "what are you learning?" She looked around the table at faces that seemed both familiar and completely new. "I'm learning," she said slowly, "that I've been managing people instead of knowing them. That I've been so afraid of losing my position that I forgot to see the human beings I work with every day." Outside, the first news van was pulling up to the restaurant's front entrance. Social media notifications continued their relentless chiming. The world was watching, waiting for statements and apologies and someone to blame. But inside Le Jardin Noir, something more important was happening. People were talking, really talking, about the assumptions that divided them and the shared experiences that could unite them. "This is going to be a long night," David said, looking at his phone as another news outlet requested comment. "But if we're going to survive this, all of us, we need to do it together." Elena looked around the table at her colleagues, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. People with dreams and fears and stories that mattered. People who, like her, were trying to build something meaningful in a world that often seemed designed to tear it down. "Together," she repeated, the word carrying more weight than she'd ever given it before. As the news crews gathered outside and social media continued its brutal judgment, David and Elena found themselves bound together not by choice, but by circumstance. They would either sink together under the weight of this crisis, or they would find a way to transform it into something that could heal rather than hurt. The night was young, and the hardest conversations still lay ahead. As the restaurant staff began sharing their stories around the central table, David felt the familiar weight of his own past settling onto his shoulders like an old heavy coat. The news vans outside multiplied, their bright lights casting harsh shadows through the restaurant's elegant windows, but inside Le Jardin Noir, a different kind of illumination was taking place. "Before we go any further," David said, his voice cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation, "I need to tell you something about why this restaurant exists. Why I bought it, why I've stayed anonymous, and why tonight matters more than any of you realize." Elena watched his face transform as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small worn photograph. Even from across the table, she could see it was old, the edges soft with handling. "This is my daughter Lily," David said, setting the photo on the table where everyone could see. The image showed a beautiful mixed-race girl, perhaps 8 years old, with David's intelligent eyes and a smile that could light up rooms. "She died 3 years ago. Leukemia." The words fell into silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. Around the table, faces softened with sympathy and recognition of grief that transcended every other difference. "The last good day we had together," David continued, his voice steady but distant, "she asked me to take her somewhere special for lunch. She was feeling better after a round of chemo, and she wanted to celebrate by going to a fancy restaurant like the ones Daddy visits for work." Elena's chest tightened as she began to understand where this story was leading. "We went to Lou Bernardin in New York. I was wearing a $1,000 suit, driving a car that cost more than most people's houses. But Lily was 8, and she was excited, so she was loud. Happy. She kept asking questions about the fish, wanted to know if the lobsters had names, laughed at everything." David's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. "The maitre d' seated us, but I could see the looks. The whispered conversations at other tables. A black man with a mixed-race child who didn't know how to behave in their precious establishment. When Lily accidentally knocked over her water glass, the server treated it like she'd committed a crime." Elena felt sick. She knew this story, had been part of versions of it more times than she wanted to count. "They didn't throw us out," David said. "Nothing that dramatic. But they made it clear we were unwelcome. Every interaction was cold, dismissive. They served us the food and took our money, but they stole something more valuable, They stole my daughter's joy. By the time we left, she was quiet, withdrawn. She kept asking if she'd done something wrong. He looked up from the photograph, his eyes finding Elena's across the table. That was the day I decided to buy restaurants. Not to make money, I already had plenty. But to create spaces where families like mine could celebrate special moments without having their humanity questioned. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of loss and purpose. Elena realized that every elegant detail of Le Jardin Noir, the warm lighting that flattered every skin tone, the tables spaced for privacy without isolation, the carefully diverse art on the walls, had been chosen through the lens of a father's love and grief. Lily died 6 months after that lunch, David continued. And I kept buying restaurants, kept trying to build something that would honor her memory. Places where joy was welcome, where families could create good memories instead of painful ones. Carlos, the sous chef, spoke into the silence. Boss, I never knew. I'm so sorry. David nodded acknowledgement but kept his focus on Elena. So when you looked at me tonight and decided I didn't belong here, you weren't just rejecting me. You were rejecting everything I built in my daughter's honor. You were perpetuating the exact system that stole her last good day. Elena felt tears she could no longer hold back spilling down her cheeks. Mr. Chin-Williams, I had no idea. Of course you didn't. Because you never asked. You saw what you expected to see and acted accordingly. David's voice wasn't cruel, but it was unforgiving in its honesty. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge now that you have it? Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to find words adequate to the magnitude of what she'd learned. But David wasn't finished. Tell me about your family, Ms. Vasquez. What brought you to this job, to this city? What are you fighting for? The question caught Elena off guard. In all her years of working in restaurants, no one had ever asked about her family, her dreams, the forces that drove her to work 70-hour weeks and send most of her paycheck to another country. My mother, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She's in San Salvador. She has diabetes, and the medication. It costs more than most people there make in a month. Elena looked around the table, seeing curiosity rather than judgment in her colleagues' faces. These people she'd managed for months, whose schedules she'd arranged and whose performance she'd evaluated, were looking at her like she was a person with a story worth hearing. I came here when I was 22, she continued, words coming easier now. With a high school education and $200. I slept in a shelter for 3 months while I looked for work. The first restaurant that hired me was not like this place. The owner treated the staff like servants, the customers like we were invisible. Jennifer, the sommelier, leaned forward. What kept you going? Phone calls home, Elena said, surprising herself with the admission. Every Sunday, my mother would tell me about her week, her friends, her health. And every Sunday, I would promise her that I was building something better. That her sacrifice, sending me here, would mean something. She paused, remembering those early years of exhaustion and loneliness, of learning English from television and restaurant etiquette from observation and mimicry. I learned to read people quickly because I had to. Which customers would tip well, which ones would complain, which managers would promote based on merit, and which ones had other priorities. Elena's voice hardened slightly. I learned to protect myself by becoming indispensable, by anticipating problems before they happened, by maintaining standards that couldn't be questioned. And part of maintaining those standards, David said quietly, was keeping out anyone who might threaten them. Elena nodded, shame burning in her chest. I became what I thought successful restaurant managers were supposed to be. Exclusive. Discriminating. I told myself I was protecting the establishment, but really I was protecting my position. Around the table, she could see recognition in her colleagues' faces. They understood the fear that drove people to become gatekeepers, the way survival instincts could transform into cruelty. But there's something else, Elena said, her voice dropping even lower. Something I've never told anyone. David waited, sensing that whatever came next would be crucial. When I was 15, still in El Salvador, my father took me to the capital for a job interview. A hotel restaurant was hiring servers, and we thought it might be my chance to help the family. Elena's hands clenched in her lap. The manager took one look at me, a girl from the countryside, wearing borrowed clothes, and he laughed. He said I wasn't appropriate for his establishment. Those were his exact words. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Elena had become the person who had once crushed her own dreams. I swore that night that I would never let anyone make me feel that small again, she continued. I would never be the person on the outside, begging to be let in. But somehow, in protecting myself from being rejected, I became the person doing the rejecting. David studied her face, seeing the broken teenager beneath the polished professional veneer. So when you saw me tonight, what did you see? Elena closed her eyes, forcing herself to confront the ugly truth. I saw someone who might expose me as a fraud. Someone who might remind everyone that I wasn't born to this, that I'm just a girl from a poor family who learned to play a role. She opened her eyes, meeting David's gaze directly. I saw a threat to the identity I'd spent 15 years building. And I tried to eliminate that threat by making you feel the way that hotel manager made me feel. The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of recognized sin and the possibility of absolution. Outside, the news crews were setting up for live broadcasts. Social media continued its relentless dissection of the evening's events. The world was demanding justice, accountability, heads on stakes. But inside the restaurant, something more complex was happening. Two people who had been shaped by discrimination were recognizing themselves in each other's stories, seeing how pain could twist into cruelty, how survival could become oppression. Elena, David said softly, what would have happened if that hotel manager had given you a chance instead of dismissing you? She considered the question. Everything would have been different. I might never have left El Salvador. My mother might have gotten better medical care. I might have learned that success didn't require building walls to keep other people out. And what might happen if I gave you a chance now? The question carried implications that terrified and thrilled Elena in equal measure. She looked around the table at her colleagues, people she was finally beginning to see as individuals rather than assets to be managed. I don't know, she admitted. But I'd like to find out. David reached across the table and turned his daughter's photograph so Elena could see it clearly. Lily's bright eyes seemed to look directly at her, full of the joy that had been dimmed by prejudice and small-mindedness. If you're going to change, David said, it has to be for the right reasons. Not to save your job or repair your reputation, but because you understand that every person who walks through that door is someone's child, someone's love, someone's hope for a better day. Elena looked at Lily's photograph, then at David's face, seeing past the successful businessman to the grieving father who had tried to transform his loss into something meaningful. I understand, she said, and for the first time that evening, she truly meant it. Outside, the circus of judgment continued. But inside Le Jardin Noir, redemption was becoming possible, not through punishment or public apology, but through the painful necessary work of seeing each other as fully human. The hardest conversation still lay ahead, but the foundation for transformation had been laid in honesty, grief, and the radical possibility that people could change if they chose to see beyond their own pain. The grandfather clock in the corner of Le Jardin Noir chimed 10:30, its deep notes resonating through the empty restaurant like a meditation bell. Outside, the media circus had grown to include 3 news vans, a handful of protesters with signs reading "Justice for David," and curious onlookers live-streaming the scene. But inside, the staff meeting had evolved into something none of them had expected, a genuine conversation about human connection. David had moved from his position at the head of the table to sit beside Elena, Lily's photograph resting between them like a bridge. The formal hierarchy of boss and employee had dissolved into something more fundamental, 2 people who had been wounded by the world and were trying to figure out how to heal. You know what's strange? Elena said, studying the picture of Lily with her gap-toothed grin and dancing eyes. She looks like she was fearless. David's expression softened. She was. Completely, absolutely fearless. She'd walk up to strangers and start conversations, ask them about their pets or their favorite ice cream flavors. She never met a person she didn't think could become a friend. Around the table, the staff had broken into smaller conversations. Carlos was showing Jennifer photos of his twin daughters back in Mexico. Marcus was explaining to the hostess how he'd learned to navigate predominantly white law school environments. The artificial barriers of the workplace hierarchy had temporarily dissolved, replaced by the more authentic connections of people sharing their stories. "I used to be like that," Elena admitted, touching the edge of Lily's photo gently. "Before the hotel incident, before I learned to see danger in difference. When I was little, I talked to everyone at the market, vendors, customers, even the stray dogs. My mother used to joke that I collected people like other kids collected stamps." "What happened to that little girl?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Elena was quiet for a moment, watching Carlos gesture animatedly as he described his daughter's personalities to Jennifer. She learned that the world could be cruel to people like her. So she decided to become someone the world couldn't hurt. By hurting others first. By maintaining distance, Elena corrected softly. "I told myself it was professional, but really, I was just scared. Scared of being seen as inadequate, scared of losing what I'd built, scared of." She paused, searching for words to describe a fear she'd never articulated. "Scared of being human," David finished for her. Elena nodded, surprised by how well he understood. When you're fighting for survival, vulnerability feels like luxury you can't afford. David leaned back in his chair, studying Elena's face in the warm light of the restaurant's chandeliers. For the first time all evening, he saw past the professional facade to the person beneath, someone who had armored herself against the world's cruelty, just as he had done after Lily's death. "After Lily died," he said quietly, "I spent 2 years avoiding children completely. Couldn't bear to see their joy, their innocence, their belief that the world was basically good. I'd cross the street to avoid playgrounds, leave restaurants if families with young kids came in." Elena looked at him with surprise. "But you built all this for families, for children." "Eventually. But first, I had to work through my anger. At the doctors who couldn't save her, at God for taking her, at myself for not being able to protect her from the world's ugliness." David's voice grew thoughtful. "It was my therapist who helped me realize I was becoming bitter. That I was letting grief turn me into someone Lily wouldn't have recognized." He gestured to the restaurant around them. "All of this, the warm lighting, the inclusive hiring, the way we train staff to see each guest as someone's beloved family member, it started as therapy. A way to channel my grief into something constructive." Elena felt a shift in her chest, a loosening of something that had been tight for years. "So when I rejected you tonight, I wasn't just discriminating against a customer. I was attacking everything you built to honor your daughter's memory." "Yes," David said simply. "But now I'm wondering if maybe that's exactly what needed to happen." Elena looked at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" David picked up his daughter's photograph, studying her face as if seeing it for the first time. "Lily used to say that broken things could become beautiful if you were careful about how you put them back together. She was 7 when she said that, talking about a vase she'd accidentally knocked over. I thought it was just kid wisdom, but maybe." He trailed off, looking around the restaurant at his staff engaged in the kind of genuine conversations that rarely happened in workplace settings. Marcus was laughing at something Carlos had said. Jennifer was showing the hostess photos from her trip to France. Even the kitchen prep cooks had joined the discussion, sharing stories of their families back home. "Maybe what?" Elena prompted. "Maybe sometimes things have to break completely before they can be rebuilt properly." David's voice carried a note of wonder, as if he was discovering something unexpected. "Look at us. Look at them. When's the last time you've seen your staff talking to each other as people rather than just colleagues? Elena followed his gaze, seeing her team with fresh eyes. In all her years of managing restaurants, she'd focused on efficiency, service standards, profit margins. She'd never considered that her staff might have rich inner lives worth exploring, dreams worth nurturing, stories worth hearing. Never, she admitted. I've been so focused on managing their work that I never thought about understanding their hearts. Hearts, David repeated, smiling slightly. Lily would have loved that phrase. She always said people's hearts were more interesting than their jobs. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Carlos approached their corner of the table with 2 plates of food. Boss, I thought you and Elena might be hungry. I made Lily's favorite, the pasta primavera with extra basil. David looked up in surprise. You remember what Lily liked? Carlos's weathered face broke into a gentle smile. Boss, you brought her to the kitchen every time you visited during construction. She'd always ask me to make her grown-up pasta with vegetables. Said it made her feel sophisticated. He paused, his expression growing serious. She was a special little girl. I still light a candle for her at my church. Elena watched the exchange, seeing yet another layer of connection she'd missed during her months of managing the restaurant. Carlos hadn't just been preparing food, he'd been carrying the memory of a beloved child, honoring her through his cooking even years after her death. I never knew, she whispered. Because you never asked, Carlos said, not unkindly. You're a good manager, Elena, but you've kept yourself apart from us. Tonight is the first time we've talked as people instead of just as boss and employees. As Carlos returned to the kitchen, David and Elena sat in companionable silence, picking at the pasta that carried the weight of memory and love. Around them, the staff continued their conversations, the artificial barriers of hierarchy dissolved by shared vulnerability. This feels different, Elena said eventually. What does? Being here. Being with people. Usually, I'm performing my role as manager, confident, decisive, slightly distant to maintain authority. But tonight I just feel human. David nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. After Lily died, I forgot how to be just David. I was always the CEO, the successful businessman, the grieving father. It's been years since I've sat in a room and just talked with people about who they really are. Elena looked at him, really looked, seeing past the expensive clothes and commanding presence to the man who missed his daughter, who had transformed grief into purpose, who was choosing compassion over revenge despite having every right to be angry. David, she said, using his first name for the first time all evening. What happens now? I mean, after tonight. The videos, the media attention, the damage to your reputation. How do we fix that? David was quiet for a long moment, considering not just her question but the shift represented by her use of we instead of I. Somehow, without either of them planning it, they had become partners in navigating this crisis. I don't know, he admitted. But I know what doesn't work. Public apologies that sound rehearsed, diversity training that treats prejudice like a policy problem, firing people to make examples without addressing the systems that created the problem in the first place. So what does work? David gestured to the scene around them, staff members from different backgrounds sharing stories, finding common ground, seeing each other as complex human beings rather than just co-workers. This, he said simply. People talking to each other honestly. Sharing their stories, acknowledging their mistakes, committing to do better not because they have to, but because they want to. Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to save their job, but the deeper hope of someone discovering that change was actually possible. I want to do better, she said quietly. Not just as a manager, but as a person. I want to be someone who builds bridges instead of walls. That's going to be hard work, David warned. Changing patterns that have been years in the making. Learning to see people before you see categories. Choosing vulnerability over self-protection. Elena nodded, accepting the challenge. Will you help me? The question surprised them both. Earlier in the evening, they had been adversaries, discriminator and victim, employee and boss, perpetrator and target of injustice. Now they were something unprecedented, two flawed human beings who had found common ground in their shared recognition that they could both do better. Yes, David said without hesitation. But not just me. All of us. He gestured to the staff around them. If we're going to rebuild this restaurant's culture, it has to be together. As a family. As the evening wore on, something beautiful was emerging from the ashes of discrimination and pain. Not just forgiveness, but something rarer, genuine understanding between people who had every reason to remain enemies. Outside, the media circus continued its demands for justice. But inside Le Jardin Noir, justice was taking a different form, the radical act of seeing each other as fully human, worthy of grace, capable of growth. The night was far from over, and the hardest tests still lay ahead. But for the first time in years, both David and Elena felt like they were exactly where they needed to be, not despite the crisis they faced, but because of it. In breaking completely, they had discovered the possibility of becoming something new. The warm bubble of connection that had enveloped Le Jardin Noir shattered at exactly 11:47 p.m., when Elena's phone rang with a call that would change everything. The staff had been deep in conversation, Marcus sharing his law school struggles with Jennifer, Carlos teaching the hostess basic Spanish phrases, David and Elena planning how to address the media crisis together, when a harsh ringtone cut through the gentle atmosphere like a blade. Elena glanced at the screen and her face went pale. "It's my mother," she said, stepping away from the table to answer. "Mommy? ¿Qué pasó?" David watched Elena's expression transform as rapid Spanish filled the quiet restaurant. Her posture stiffened, her free hand pressed against her forehead, and her voice rose with each exchange. The staff gradually fell silent, sensing crisis even without understanding the language. After 5 minutes of increasingly frantic conversation, Elena hung up and turned back to the group. Her face was tear-streaked, her professional composure completely abandoned. "I have to go," she said, grabbing her purse with shaking hands. "My mother, she's in the hospital. Diabetic coma. They don't know if..." She couldn't finish the sentence. David stood immediately. "Elena, of course. Go. We'll handle everything here." But Elena was already scrolling through her phone with desperate fingers. "The flights. There's nothing until tomorrow afternoon. And I don't have, the emergency flight costs $3,000. I don't have $3,000. The vulnerability in her voice was heartbreaking. Here was the composed restaurant manager who had handled every crisis with calculated precision, reduced to a terrified daughter facing the possible loss of her mother with insufficient resources to reach her bedside. David reached for his wallet without hesitation. "I'll cover it. Whatever you need." Elena looked up sharply, her eyes blazing with something that wasn't gratitude. "No. Elena, this isn't the time for pride." "Pride?" Elena's voice cracked. "You think this is about pride?" She stood, pacing to the window where the news vans waited like vultures. In the harsh glare of their lights, her reflection looked haunted, fractured. "Don't you see what's happening here?" she said, turning back to face David and the assembled staff. 3 hours ago, I was a racist manager who discriminated against her own boss. Now suddenly I'm the reformed bigot learning important lessons about humanity. And you're the noble victim who's choosing forgiveness over vengeance." David frowned, not understanding where her anger was coming from. "Elena, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the story we're creating." Elena's voice rose, sharp with pain and fury. The redemption narrative that plays so well for the cameras. The heartwarming tale of how a powerful black man transformed a prejudiced woman through the power of understanding. Her words hit the room like a physical blow. The staff shifted uncomfortably, the fragile bonds they'd been building suddenly feeling artificial, manipulative. "That's not what this is," David said quietly, but Elena wasn't finished. Isn't it? Think about it, David. What happens when we go public with tonight's story? The racist manager who saw the error of her ways, the compassionate CEO who chose education over termination. It's perfect PR. It transforms your discrimination scandal into a triumph of human connection. She laughed, a sound devoid of humor. And all it costs is my dignity. I become the poster child for how prejudice can be cured through exposure to your superior moral character. The grateful recipient of your benevolent wisdom. David felt something cold settling in his stomach. You think I planned this? I think you're a businessman who recognizes an opportunity when he sees one. Elena's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steel. My mother is dying, and the only way I can reach her is by accepting charity from the man I wronged. How convenient for your narrative. How perfectly it demonstrates your magnanimous nature. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Around the table, staff members who had been sharing their hearts just minutes earlier now looked uncertain, questioning whether the connections they'd felt were real or manufactured. Michael Torres, who had been quietly observing from the bar, stepped forward. Elena, you're upset about your mother. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearly for the first time all night. Elena whirled on him. You want to know what I'm learning? I'm learning that even kindness can be a form of power. Even forgiveness can be a way to maintain control. She turned back to David, her face twisted with anguish. You could have just fired me. Clean, simple, justified. But instead, you chose this elaborate process of redemption. Why? Because it serves you better. The man who transforms enemies into allies, who heals social divisions through personal grace. David's jaw tightened. You think I'm using your mother's illness for public relations? I think you're using everything for something, Elena shot back. Your daughter's memory, my prejudice, this whole evening, it's all material for the story you want to tell about yourself. The words hit David like physical blows. He thought of Lily's photograph, still sitting on the table between two half-eaten plates of pasta. Of the genuine moments he'd shared with Elena, the recognition he'd felt when she'd talked about building walls to protect herself from the world's cruelty. That's not fair, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Fair. Elena laughed bitterly. You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that my moment of human weakness gets broadcast across social media? Is it fair that my mother is dying while I'm trapped in your restaurant, playing out some elaborate morality play for your benefit? She grabbed her coat from the back of her chair, movements sharp with fury and pain. You know what the worst part is? For a few hours tonight, I actually believed it. I thought maybe people could change, maybe understanding was possible, maybe connection could grow from conflict. Elena's voice broke on the last words. But this was never about me changing. It was about you proving that you could change me. About demonstrating your power to transform your enemies through the sheer force of your moral superiority. Elena, stop. David stepped toward her, but she backed away as if his proximity was toxic. No, you stop. Stop pretending this is about justice or growth or healing. You're using my prejudice to serve your agenda, just like I used my position to serve mine. We're both manipulators, David. The only difference is that you're better at making it look noble. The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos looked stricken, Jennifer seemed on the verge of tears, and Marcus was staring at his hands as if he'd witnessed something obscene. David felt the carefully constructed evening collapsing around him. The genuine connections, the shared stories, the fragile hope that understanding could bridge any divide, all of it crumbling under Elena's accusations. And the worst part was that he couldn't completely dismiss what she was saying. There was a voice in his head asking uncomfortable questions. Had he prolonged the evening because it served his interests? Was his desire to help her driven by genuine compassion or sophisticated damage control? When he offered to pay for her flight, was he responding to her pain or protecting his image? You're right, he said quietly, the words tasting like ash. About some of it, anyway. I did see an opportunity tonight. A chance to turn a disaster into something positive. But Elena. He looked at her, seeing not an employee or a problem to be solved, but a woman in agony. Your mother is dying. Whatever my motives, whatever story this becomes, that's the only thing that matters right now. Elena's anger flickered, replaced briefly by something that might have been hope. But then her phone buzzed with a text message, and she read it with growing horror. It's too late anyway, she said, her voice hollow. That was my cousin. My mother, she's gone. The words hit the room like a meteor strike. Elena sank into the nearest chair, her strength completely depleted, and began to cry with the raw animal sound of someone whose world had just ended. Around the table, David's staff sat in stunned silence, witnessing the collapse of a woman who had lost everything: her mother, her job, her dignity, and her faith in the possibility of human connection, all in a single evening. David stared at Elena's broken form, feeling the weight of every choice he'd made that night. Had his desire for redemption cost her the chance to say goodbye to her mother? Had his need to transform crisis into opportunity prevented him from simply letting her leave when she first asked? Outside, the news crews were packing up their equipment, satisfied with whatever story they'd managed to construct from fragments and speculation. Social media had already moved on to the next outrage, the next viral moment, the next opportunity for public judgment. But inside Le Jardin Noir, two people sat in the wreckage of what might have been a genuine connection, wondering if trust, once shattered, could ever be rebuilt. Elena's sobs filled the elegant restaurant, each one an accusation, a lament, a prayer for something that could never be recovered. And David, surrounded by the empire he'd built in his daughter's memory, wondered if he had become the very thing he'd once fought against, someone who used power, however benevolently, to control the narrative of other people's pain. The night was far from over, but the possibility of redemption had never seemed more distant. The silence following Elena's breakdown stretched like a chasm through Le Jardin Noir. Her sobs had quieted to exhausted whimpers, and she sat hunched in her chair, staring at her phone's black screen as if it might somehow bring her mother back. Around the table, David's staff seemed frozen, unsure whether to comfort, retreat, or pretend they hadn't witnessed the complete destruction of their manager's world. David stood alone near the window, watching his reflection in the glass while the last news van packed up outside. The media had gotten their story, or at least, the version they'd construct from scattered footage and second-hand accounts. By morning, the internet would have rendered its verdict on the night's events, reducing complex human pain to hashtags and hot takes. But here, in the aftermath of Elena's accusations, David faced a more fundamental question. Who was he when no one was watching? When there were no cameras to perform for, no reputation to protect, no narrative to control? Boss, Carlos's voice cut through the quiet, tentative but determined. Should we leave you two alone? David turned from the window, looking at his staff, people who had shared their stories, opened their hearts, and witnessed something that would change how they saw both him and Elena forever. In their faces, he saw confusion, sympathy, and the uncomfortable recognition that good intentions could still cause profound harm. No, he said quietly. Stay. All of you. Because Elena was right about something. We've all been performing tonight. Playing roles in a story that felt good to tell ourselves. But if we're going to be honest, really honest, then let's do it together. Elena looked up from her phone, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. Honest about what? About how you used my mother's death to make yourself look compassionate. The accusation still stung, but David forced himself to sit across from her, close enough that she couldn't mistake his sincerity for performance. Honest about the fact that you might be right. That maybe part of me did see an opportunity in your prejudice. A chance to be the hero instead of the victim. His admission sent a ripple of surprise through the room. Elena had clearly expected denial, defensiveness, or corporate doublespeak. The simple acknowledgement of complicity in his own narrative seemed to disarm her. But Elena, David continued, his voice steady despite the pain in his chest. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. When you were sharing stories with Jennifer and Carlos, when you were learning about their lives and letting them see yours, was that performance? Were you just playing a role in my redemption narrative?" Elena opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. The question had caught her off guard, forcing her to examine her own motivations during the evening's most genuine moments. "Because if it was," David said gently, "then you're a better actress than I gave you credit for. The woman I saw tonight, the one who cried when she realized how she'd hurt people, who asked hard questions about her own prejudices, who wanted to learn how to build bridges instead of walls, that woman seemed real to me." Elena's breath caught. She looked around the table at her colleagues, seeing not the professional relationships she'd maintained for months, but the human connections she'd begun to build through shared vulnerability. "It wasn't performance," she whispered. "When Jennifer talked about being underestimated in France, when Carlos shared photos of his daughters, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Like I belonged somewhere. Like people could see me as more than just my job title." "Then maybe," David said carefully, "we're both more complicated than your accusations suggest. Maybe I can simultaneously be a grieving father who built restaurants to honor his daughter's memory and a businessman who recognized a PR opportunity. Maybe you can be both a woman shaped by discrimination who acted from fear and someone genuinely capable of growth and change." Jennifer, who had been silent since Elena's breakdown, spoke up hesitantly. "When I shared my story earlier, about being dismissed in culinary school, was that part of some narrative too? Because it felt real to me. It felt like the first time anyone at work had cared about who I am beyond my wine pairings." Marcus nodded. "Same here. I've been working here 8 months, and tonight was the first time I felt like you all saw me as a person with dreams, not just the guy who seats tables." Elena felt something cracking inside her chest, not the sharp break of earlier pain, but the slow crumble of walls she'd spent years building. These people weren't performing for David's benefit. They were sharing genuine pieces of themselves because, for the first time, the space had been created for that kind of truth. "I'm scared," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm terrified that if I admit tonight meant something, if I acknowledge that I actually changed, then I'm just playing into your story. But I'm equally terrified that if I reject everything that happened here, I'll go back to being the person I was this morning, someone who hurt people because she was too afraid to see them clearly." David leaned forward, and Elena could see her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. "So what do we choose to believe? That every human connection is strategic, every moment of growth is performance, every act of kindness serves a hidden agenda? Or do we choose to believe that people can surprise themselves, that understanding is possible even when motives are mixed, that love can grow in the most unlikely places?" The word love hung in the air like a prayer. Not romantic love. The evening had been too raw, too painful for that kind of fairy tale, but something deeper. The love that recognizes common humanity across difference, that chooses hope over cynicism, that believes in the possibility of redemption even when it comes at great cost. Elena looked at David, really looked at him, seeing not the successful CEO or the grieving father or the man who might be using her story for his benefit, but simply another human being trying to figure out how to navigate a broken world with integrity intact. "Your daughter," she said quietly, "would she have wanted you to help me tonight? Even knowing what I did, even understanding my prejudice, would she have wanted you to show mercy?" David's eyes filled with tears at the question. He thought of Lily's fearless compassion, her ability to see potential friends in every stranger, her belief that broken things could become beautiful if you were careful about how you put them back together. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "She would have wanted me to help. Not because it serves my interests, but because that's who she believed people could be. Who she believed I could be." Elena reached across the table and picked up Lily's photograph, studying the bright eyes and infectious smile. "Then maybe that's our answer. Maybe we choose to be the people she believed we could be, regardless of our complicated motives or mixed-up hearts or fear of being manipulated." She looked around the table at the staff who had become something like family over the course of one impossible evening. I can't get on a plane to say goodbye to my mother. But I can choose to honor her memory by becoming the person she raised me to be, someone who builds bridges instead of walls, who sees hearts before categories, who believes in the possibility of connection even when it's scary. David felt something shifting in his chest, a loosening of the tight grip he'd kept on his daughter's legacy. And I can choose to honor Lily by creating spaces where people like her, fearless, loving, hopeful people, can flourish. Not because it makes me look good, but because it's the right thing to do. The restaurant fell quiet again, but this silence was different, not heavy with recrimination, but pregnant with possibility. Around the table, people who had started the evening as strangers were looking at each other with something that might become love, given time and careful tending. So what happens now? Elena asked. Tomorrow, when the story breaks, when people demand accountability, when my face is plastered across social media as the racist manager, what do we do then? David considered the question, weighing his options not as a CEO protecting his empire, but as a man trying to live up to his daughter's faith in human goodness. We tell the truth, he said finally. All of it. The discrimination, the hurt, the complicated process of learning to see each other clearly. We admit that growth is messy, that understanding doesn't happen in neat arcs, that people can be both flawed and worthy of grace. He looked directly at Elena. And we offer you a choice. You can leave with a good reference, support for your mother's medical expenses that are no longer needed, and the understanding that tonight changed all of us. Or you can stay, and help me build something better. Not as my redemption story, but as your own. Elena felt tears spilling down her cheeks again, but these were different from the earlier sobs of grief and rage. These were tears of recognition, of hope tentatively emerging from the ashes of the worst night of her professional life. If I stay, she said slowly, it's not because you saved me. It's because we saved each other. Because tonight proved that people can choose to become better than their worst moments. In your own life, when have you had to choose between cynicism and hope, between self-protection and vulnerability? What helped you make that choice? Share your story in the comments. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the edges of the city skyline. The crisis that had brought them together was far from over. There would be interviews, investigations, and the long, careful work of rebuilding trust with the community they served. But inside Le Jardin Noir, surrounded by the people who had witnessed their worst and chosen to believe in their potential for better, David and Elena made the choice that would define the rest of their lives. They chose to believe in love. Complicated, imperfect, hard-won love that grows not in spite of our flaws, but through the courageous work of facing them together. The hardest part was over. Now came the beautiful, terrifying work of becoming the people they decided to be. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez stood at the podium of the National Restaurant Association's annual conference, looking out at an audience of over 2,000 hospitality professionals. The same hands that had once trembled with prejudice now held steady as she gripped the microphone, preparing to deliver the keynote address that would have been unimaginable half a year ago. 6 months ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, I was a restaurant manager who thought success meant keeping the wrong people out. Today, I'm here to talk about what I learned when I discovered that the person I was keeping out was my own boss, and more importantly, what happened when we chose transformation over termination. In the front row, David Chin Williams sat with Lily's photograph resting on the table beside his conference materials. The picture had become a fixture at these speaking events, not as a prop for his narrative, but as a reminder of the fearless love that had inspired everything that followed that terrible, beautiful night at Le Jardin Noir. The past 6 months had been a masterclass in the messy reality of redemption. The initial media firestorm had been brutal, Elena's face plastered across social media as the embodiment of restaurant racism. David criticized both for his initial anonymity and for his decision not to fire her immediately. #FireElena had trended for 3 days. Protesters had gathered outside the restaurant. Several corporate clients had canceled events. But something unexpected had happened when David and Elena appeared together on Good Morning America 2 weeks after the incident. Instead of offering the sanitized apology narrative everyone expected, they had told the complex truth about Elena's prejudice and David's mixed motives, about the painful process of learning to see each other clearly, about choosing growth over punishment and understanding over revenge. The thing about authentic change, Elena continued from the podium, is that it doesn't happen in a single evening of dramatic revelation. It happens in small, daily choices. The choice to ask your employees about their families instead of just their performance metrics. The choice to examine your assumptions before they become actions. The choice to believe that people can grow beyond their worst moments. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, a photo of Le Jardin Noir's staff taken just last week. The same people who had witnessed her breakdown and David's reckoning, now thriving in an environment transformed by radical honesty and mutual respect. Carlos Mendez, our sous chef, now leads monthly storytelling sessions where staff share their backgrounds and dreams. Jennifer Williams has developed a mentorship program for young women entering the sommelier profession. Marcus Thompson graduated law school last month and will be starting at a civil rights firm in the fall, but he's staying on weekends because, as he puts it, he's never worked anywhere that felt so much like family. The audience was quiet, absorbed in a story that defied easy categorization. This wasn't the typical corporate redemption narrative or the simple tale of a racist learning to be better. It was something more complex and honest. The story of what happens when people choose the difficult work of actually understanding each other. Elena's voice softened as she approached the heart of her speech. I want to be very clear about something. What happened to me that night wasn't a magical transformation. It was the beginning of the hardest work I've ever done, confronting not just my prejudices, but the fears that created them. Learning to lead not through distance and control, but through vulnerability and connection. She paused, looking directly at David in the front row. And working alongside someone who had every reason to write me off, but chose instead to believe that I could become better than my worst moment. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine. Elena had become an unlikely voice in the hospitality industry, speaking not as a reformed racist, but as someone who had done the deep work of examining how fear could masquerade as professionalism, how survival instincts could become oppression, how people could change if they were willing to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. After the presentation, Elena joined David at a quiet table in the hotel restaurant where the conference was being held. The formal distance between boss and employee had long since evolved into something that defied easy definition. Not quite friendship, not quite family, but a bond forged in the fire of mutual recognition and tested by the daily choice to see each other clearly. How do you think it went? Elena asked, settling into her chair with the easy confidence she developed over months of public speaking. Lily would have been proud, David said simply, touching his daughter's photograph. Not just of what you said, but of who you've become. Elena smiled, the expression free of the defensive calculation that had once defined her professional demeanor. I've been thinking about something you said that night. About how broken things can become beautiful if you're careful about how you put them back together. Lily's wisdom, David acknowledged. She was 7 when she said that, but she understood something I'm still learning. Which is? David looked around the restaurant where they sat, not his restaurant, but one that felt familiar in its careful attention to making every guest feel welcome, its diverse staff moving with the easy rhythm of people who enjoyed their work, its atmosphere of genuine hospitality rather than performative exclusivity. That the goal isn't to fix broken things by making them look like they were never damaged, he said thoughtfully. The goal is to create something new from the pieces, something that acknowledges the breaking but doesn't let it define the outcome. Elena nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Their working relationship bore no resemblance to the hierarchical structure they'd started with. Elena had become not just a manager but a partner in David's vision for transforming restaurant culture. She now oversaw training programs at all 17 of his establishments, teaching managers how to create inclusive environments not through policy mandates but through the harder work of genuine human connection. Speaking of new things, Elena said, pulling out her phone, I have something to show you. The email on her screen was from the James Beard Foundation, formally inviting Le Jardin Noir to host their annual Diversity and Inclusion Summit. The recognition represented the restaurant industry's acknowledgement that David and Elena's approach, messy, honest, grounded in real relationships rather than corporate initiatives, was actually working. They want both of us to speak, Elena said. About the night everything changed, but also about what came after. The real work of building something better. David read the invitation, feeling the weight of how far they'd all come. The restaurant that had nearly been destroyed by discrimination had become a model for how establishments could address prejudice not through punishment or platitudes, but through the radical act of treating everyone, staff and customers alike, as complex human beings worthy of dignity and grace. What do you think Lily would say about all this? Elena asked, a question she'd posed several times over the months as they'd navigated the challenges of rebuilding trust with their community. David considered the question, looking at his daughter's bright eyes in the photograph. I think she'd say we finally figured out how to make friends with strangers. That we learned to see hearts before categories. As the evening wound down, Elena and David made their way back to the hotel lobby. Tomorrow, they would fly back to the city where it all started, to the restaurant that had become not just a place of business but a laboratory for the kind of radical hospitality that honors everyone who enters as someone's beloved child. David, Elena said as they waited for the elevator, I need to tell you something I've never said before. He looked at her with curiosity, noting the seriousness in her tone. I'm grateful it happened, she said quietly. The discrimination, the confrontation, the worst night of my professional life, I'm grateful for all of it. Because it led to this. To becoming the person I was meant to be instead of the person I thought I needed to be to survive. David felt tears prick his eyes, remembering the broken woman who had sat in his restaurant 6 months ago, convinced that kindness was manipulation and connection was performance. The woman standing beside him now was someone entirely different, not because she'd been fixed or saved, but because she'd chosen the difficult path of genuine transformation. And I'm grateful, he said, that I learned the difference between honoring Lily's memory and hiding behind it. Between using my grief as a shield and using it as a bridge. The elevator arrived, and as they rode up to their respective floors, both David and Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them here. They had started as strangers divided by prejudice and power. They had become something unprecedented in either of their experiences, true partners in the work of creating spaces where love could grow between people who had every reason to remain enemies. As Elena unlocked her hotel room door, she thought about her mother, not with the sharp grief of 6 months ago, but with the warm recognition that her mother's values lived on in the bridges Elena now built instead of the walls she once maintained. Maria Vasquez had raised a daughter to see the dignity in every person, and despite years of forgetting that lesson, Elena had finally remembered how to honor it. And David, settling into his room with Lily's photograph on the nightstand beside him, felt his daughter's presence not as a weight of grief but as a gentle encouragement toward the fearless love she had embodied. Tomorrow, he would return to Le Jardin Noir, not as the anonymous owner testing his staff's prejudices, but as someone committed to creating the kind of place where children like Lily could celebrate special moments without having their joy diminished by others' small-mindedness. 6 months ago, a moment of discrimination had threatened to destroy everything both David and Elena had worked to build. But in choosing transformation over termination, understanding over revenge and love over fear, they had created something neither could have imagined, a partnership that proved people could grow beyond their worst moments, that understanding could bridge any divide, and that the most unexpected love, forged in crisis and tested by choice, could become the foundation for something beautiful. Outside their hotel windows, the city sparkled with the lights of thousands of restaurants, each one a potential laboratory for the radical hospitality that honors the full humanity of every person who enters. And in the morning, David and Elena would return to their work, not of managing a business, but of proving that love, authentic and hard-won, really could transform the world one conversation at a time. The broken things had indeed become beautiful, not by hiding their cracks, but by filling them with gold. 1 year later, Lily Chin Williams would have been 12 years old. On what would have been her birthday, David and Elena instituted a new tradition at Le Jardin Noir, the Lily Lunch, where children from local schools are invited to dine as honored guests, treated with the same respect and attention given to the restaurant's most distinguished patrons. Because in a world that often diminishes the joy of the young, the memory of one fearless little girl continues to ensure that celebration is always welcome, and every child knows they belong.